The salt pans gave up their first real harvest on the morning everything went wrong, and I have thought since that the timing was not an accident. A man like Lord Harrow does not move when you are weak. He moves the moment you are about to stop being weak, because that is the last moment he still can. I was out on the flats at dawn when Bram called me over to the nearest pan, and I crouched at its edge and ran my fingers through what the sun had left behind: clean, coarse, white salt, dry and heavy, the first wealth this dead ground had produced in 10 years. It was not much, a few sacks worth from the beds we had finished. But I did the arithmetic on it the way I did the arithmetic on everything, and the number at the end of the sum was the first number in either of my lives that had ever pointed up. We had made a thing worth money, out of the poison that had been killing us. In a month the pans would yield 10 times this. In a season, 100. I let myself have exactly one breath of it. Then Kessa came across the flats at a dead run, and I knew before she reached me, because Kessa only ran like that when she was carrying something that couldn't wait. The grain, Master Corliss's grain, it stopped. Harrow's men have it at the toll bridge and they won't let it pass. Corliss sent his outrider ahead to warn us. He says, "Come, my lord." He says, "Come now, or there won't be a caravan to come to." I did the other arithmetic then, the one I never stopped running underneath all the rest. Duncairn had, that morning, 6 days of food. Master Corliss's grain bought against salt I had not yet made, in the forward contract that was the only reason my people would eat through the spring, was 200 sacks of barley sitting on carts a half-day north, on the wrong side of a river, behind a man who wanted us dead. Harrow had not stopped the grain to rob it. You do not need to rob a village that is already starving. He had stopped it to hold it, to let me watch it sit there, close enough to smell, until my people were hungry enough that I would agree to anything to get it moving again. It was the cleanest kind of cruelty, the kind that never lifts a blade, and I understood it completely, because it was exactly the kind of thing I would have thought of myself. I took Gareth and Tam and 6 of the men who could ride, and I rode north. The toll bridge sat where the only firm road off the Ashmarch crossed the Greywater, a low stone span, old, with a timber gatehouse Harrow's grandfather had raised across it, and a chain that could be dropped to close the road. It was, I had learned in 8 days of studying the map of my own imprisonment, the single point through which every cart, every sack, every coin that entered or left the Ashmarch by land had to pass. One bridge, one chain. And a smiling lord who had spent a decade making sure no one ever thought to ask whether there might be another way across the water. Corliss's caravan was drawn up on the near bank, a dozen carts, tired oxen, a knot of anxious drivers. And on the bridge itself, at his ease, in good furs on a good horse, waited Lord Harrow. He had come in person. That told me how much he was enjoying it. Warden Vale. He said my title the way you'd hold a dead mouse by the tail. You've had a busy few weeks. Water, I hear, a little battle, even a whiff of trade. He gestured pleasantly at the grain carts. And now a difficulty. The road's mine, you see, my grandfather's charter, the Crown's own seal. I take a toll on all that crosses, and I've every right to inspect what moves through my land for the Crown's safety. Contraband, unpaid duties, that sort of thing. Name the toll, I said. He named it. It was not a toll. It was 4 times the value of the grain, payable in coin I did not have, and he knew I did not have it, and the knowing was the whole point. When I said nothing, he spread his hands, sorrowful as an undertaker. Can't meet it, a pity. Then the carts wait here on my land at my discretion until you can. No hardship to me, grain keeps, he smiled. Longer than people do anyway. I want to be honest about the next few seconds, because they were the worst of the day. Gareth's hand had gone still on his reins in the particular way it went still before a fight, and Harrow had 8 men in that gatehouse with crossbows, and for one hot, stupid moment every part of me that had woken up on fire in a burning village wanted to take that bridge and that chain and that smile by force. It would have felt magnificent. It would also have been exactly what he wanted. A warden of the Ashmarch drawing steel on a chartered lord doing his lawful business, in front of witnesses, giving Harrow every right to call it banditry and hang the lot of us with the crown's blessing. He hadn't blocked the road with the chain. He'd blocked it with the law, and the law was a wall I could not take with 40 men, let alone 8 tired riders. So I did the hardest thing a proud man learns to do, which is lose on purpose, cheaply, and leave with the thing that matters. "The grain waits then," I said, and I made my voice flat and beaten, because a beaten man is a man Harrow would stop watching. "I'll find your coin." I turned my horse. Behind me I heard Harrow laugh, a warm, comfortable sound, a man who had just watched a problem solve itself. And I let him laugh, and I rode back toward Duncairn with 200 sacks of my people's lives sitting on the wrong bank of a river, and I did not feel beaten at all. I felt the way I used to feel on a site when the client swore a thing couldn't be done, the cold, private, engineer certainty that a wall is only unbeatable to the man who insists on going through it. Harrow owned the bridge. He had spent 10 years making sure Duncairn believed the bridge was the only way across. I was going to find out whether he was right. You cannot argue a river into moving where you need it. But a river is only a wall in one direction, and Lord Harrow, who had grown rich guarding the one place his river could be crossed, had made the same mistake every man makes who guards a thing too long. He had stopped seeing the water as anything but the moat around his gate. He watched the bridge. He did not watch the river itself, because for 100 years there had been no reason to. I stood on the Duncairn bank of the Greywater that afternoon and made the Dominion show me the water the way I had made it show me the salt, and I read the river like a drawing, and there it was, the thing Harrow had forgotten because it had stopped being useful before he was born. The Greywater Old Channel, silted not dead, draws to the coast, once bore salt barges, bears them still. The river ran to the sea. Of course it did, all rivers do. And once, before Harrow's family turned a bridge into a fortune, the salt of the Ashmarch had not gone to market by the road at all. It had gone by water, down the Greywater on flat barges to a coastal landing where ships took it up the coast to a dozen markets, none of which paid a copper of toll to any lord named Harrow. The channel had silted when the salt trade died. The landing had rotted. 2 generations had forgotten it because a decade of Harrow charters had made the road the only road anyone alive remembered. It was, I understood, standing there with the cold water at my boots, the most Harrow-shaped weakness a man could ask for. He had built his whole power on controlling the one crossing of the river. He had never once imagined that the river itself was the road I actually wanted, that I did not need to cross his water, I needed to travel it, straight past his bridge and his chain and his smile, to a sea he did not own. There were, naturally, 3 reasons it could not be done, which is why nobody had done it, which is exactly why it was mine to do. The channel was silted, too shallow in 3 places for a laden barge. There were no barges, the last had rotted 40 years ago. And there was no one left alive in Duncairn who had ever run the old water road, because the man who could do a thing and the man who remembers it are almost never the same man, and I had learned by now not to trust my own memory of a place over the people who had actually lived in it. Except the Dominion, when I walked back into Duncairn and let it look at my own people with the question in my mind, disagreed with me about that last part. It found me a man the village had written off so completely that I had walked past him a dozen times, a lean, sun-ruined old man mending nets he had no boat for, sitting outside the last house on the water side of the village. Old Sarn, net mender, true trade, Saul Trunner, the water road, ran the Greywater 40 years gone. Loyalty, buried, bitter. His name was Sarn, and he had been, before Harrow's grandfather closed the water road and the trade with it, a Saul Trunner, one of the men who had poled the flat barges down the silted channel to the sea, back when the Ashmarch had a living to make. The road had taken his living, and his sons had gone for soldiers, and the boats had rotted, and he had spent 40 years mending nets for a village that pitied him, and no one had ever once asked him the only question he had ever wanted to be asked, which was whether he could do it again. I crouched down in front of him, the way I had crouched in front of Bram, because I was learning that this was the shape of everything I was going to build out here, one written-off man at a time, asked one real question. They tell me the Greywater used to carry salt to the sea. Barges poled down the old channel past where Harrow's bridge stands now. They tell me the men who ran it are all dead. I looked at him. Are they? He stopped mending his net. He looked at me for a long, long moment, an old man with 40 years of a swallowed thing behind his eyes, and when he spoke his voice cracked on the first word like a thing that had not been used for its true purpose in a lifetime. Who told you about the water road, boy? Does it matter? I don't need you to believe how I know. I need you to tell me if it can still be run, the channel, the shoals, the landing at the coast, or if Harrow really did kill it for good. Something came up in his ruined face that I had seen come up in Bram's, and in Call's, and that I would spend the rest of my life learning to look for. The terrible, careful, disbelieving hope of a man being handed back the one thing he was sure the world had taken for good. 3 shoals, he said slowly, between here and the sea, 2 you can pole over light. The third, the teeth, we called it, the third'll open the belly of a laden barge like a gutting knife, and it moves, it silts different every flood, so there's no chart for it, there's only a man who's felt it under a pole in the dark and knows the water by the sound. He sat up straighter, and 40 years fell off him, and his eyes were suddenly very bright and very hard. There's one man alive who knows the teeth by sound, boy. You're crouched in front of him. I had come to the Ashmarch with 3 loyal men and a village that wanted to die. In a month I had turned a drunk, a silent smith, a hard woman, my father's spy, and now an old salt runner with a drowned road in his head, and every one of them had been sitting in plain sight, worth nothing to anyone who couldn't be bothered to look. My realm was going to be an army of the overlooked, and I was going to march it straight down a river Lord Harrow had forgotten he didn't own. I did not, of course, have any barges, and the third shoal was called the Teeth, and it opened the belly of laden boats, and I had 6 days of food and a river I had never run. But for the first time since Harrow had smiled at me on his bridge, I knew where the ground was, and I have always been able to build once I can find the ground. We had 4 days of food and no boats, and the boats turned out to be the easy part, because I nearly built the wrong ones. Sarn walked me down to the boat graveyard, a row of long black rotted ribs half sunk in the mud, the skeletons of the barges that had carried the Ashmarchs living to the sea before Harrow's grandfather closed the water road. My first thought was the obvious one, the one any builder has looking at a wreck. Rebuild them. Copy the old craft, raise new hulls on the pattern of the dead ones. I was already sizing the timber in my head. Timber I did not have. Timber I would have to somehow pry out of the one man on earth least likely to sell it to me. When Sarn spat into the mud and knocked the whole idea flat with one sentence. You're thinking big deep hulls like these. These ran a full channel 40 years gone. That channel's silted now, you said it yourself. A hull that draws that deep won't float over the teeth. Boy, it'll sit down on 'em and open like a purse. Whatever we run has to ride high and shallow, or it doesn't run at all. And there it was, the thing my own lack had been trying to tell me the whole time, the way it always did if I would only shut up and listen. I had no timber and I had been cursing the shortage, and the shortage was the answer. I did not need deep timber barges. Deep timber barges would kill us on the teeth. I needed something light, flat, and shallow, that would ride high over the silt and skate across the shoals instead of gutting on them. And light, flat, and shallow was precisely what a village with no timber and 4 days could actually build. We built rafts. Long, flat, shallow draft rafts, a light frame salvaged from the old wrecks and the burned roofs, decked with tight bundled reed from the riverbanks where reed grew thick as timber never had, the whole skinned in tarred hide to turn the water. Bram worked out the framing so a laden raft would flex over a shoal instead of snapping across it. Call forged the iron lashings and the pole shoes. Kessa's scouts cut and hauled reed by the ton. Sarn stood over all of it, cursing and correcting, 40 years of a drowned trade pouring back out of him. The first raft we launched sank in the shallows before it left the inlet, because I had let the village load it the way you load a cart, heavy in the middle, everything piled high, and a flat raft loaded like a cart is a flat raft that rolls its cargo into the river and follows it down. 2 days of reed and tar and hope, gone under the gray water while the whole crew watched, and me standing on the bank having made, again, in front of everyone, exactly the kind of stupid, confident mistake a man makes when he thinks knowing the principle is the same as knowing the craft. It was Sarn who fished the lesson out of the water with the wreck. Salt did not ride like grain. You laid it thin and low and spread wide across the whole deck, so the weight sat flat and the raft rode even and high, and loaded that way, Sarn said. A reed raft would carry more salt over the teeth than one of the old deep barges ever had, because it never had to fight the shoal at all. My failure had cost me a raft in 2 days I did not have. It had also shown me again that the drowned road wanted to be run light, and that the poverty I kept cursing was, every single time, quietly handing me the better design. By the end of the 3rd day we had 6 rafts riding high in Sarn's hidden inlet, low and flat and ugly and right, and enough clean salt to load them, and 2 days of food left in Duncairn. And then Harrow's men came to take the salt. Captain Rewell rode into Duncairn at midday with a dozen men at his back and a strip of vellum in his fist, and I understood the shape of it before he opened his mouth, because it was the same shape as everything Harrow did. Not a sword, a document. Warden, my Lord Harrow's compliments. There's word you've been making salt out here a taxable good produced on land under his lordship's charter. He's owed his duty on all of it back to the first grain. Until it's paid, the salt's held as surety. He didn't dismount. We're here to inventory it and take it into his lordship's keeping. All of it. There it was. Harrow had grasped, faster than I'd hoped, that a Duncairn with something to sell was a Duncairn that might slip his noose, so he had come to take the one thing I could sell, dressed as tax, before I ever got it to a market. If I refused, I was a lord withholding the crown's duty, and he could bring soldiers and the law both. If I let him, he stripped my only wealth and I was back to a starving village on a dead flat, exactly where he wanted me and grateful to be alive. So I did not refuse. I did something worse for Harrow and better for me. I cooperated beautifully with a lie. I let Rewell inventory the salt I let him find, which was the failed first raft's soaked and half-ruined load, dragged up from the shallows and heaped in the open by the pans, perhaps a fifth of what we truly had, wet and clumped and looking like the pitiful whole output of a struggling village. I stood there wringing my hands and playing the beaten warden I had played on the bridge, and I let him see a man losing the last of his hope, and I let him take it, the ruined fifth, and write it in his ledger as the lot, and feel the warm satisfaction of a job done, while 6 loaded rafts of good dry salt sat under reed mat and tarpaulin in a silted inlet, a half-mile downriver that Captain Rewell never thought to look at, because why would a man look at a river everyone knew was dead? He took the ruined salt and my performance of despair, and he rode back to tell Harrow that Duncairn was finished. But I did not get away clean, and I want to be honest about the part that cost me. One of Rewell's men, riding down to water his horse, walked his mount along the river bank, and I saw him stop and look at the cut reed beds, the churned mud, the drag marks where 6 rafts had gone down to the inlet, and I saw him frown. He didn't understand what he was seeing. But he'd seen it, and he was the kind of man who mentions things, and Rewell was the kind of captain who reports them, and Harrow was the kind of lord who, given one loose thread about a river, would eventually pull it. I had bought us a day, maybe 2, before Harrow started wondering about the water, which meant the drowned road had to be run now tonight before the smiling lord thought to post a watch on the one thing he'd forgotten he didn't own. 2 days of food, 6 rafts, a shoal called the Teeth that no living man but Sarn could read, and a night to do it in. We loaded the last of the salt by starlight, and while the crew worked I stood apart with Gareth, because there was one more thing I had to be ready for, and it was the thing I understood least in the world. Since the battle, Gareth had drilled me every dawn, not with the sword, or not only, but with the other thing, the sealed fire the Dominion said was mine and would not explain. He could not teach me what it was. He had never seen its like. but he had spent 40 years teaching men to hold their fear in a fight, and he had decided that whatever the fire was, it answered to the same discipline. You did not grab for it in a panic, you breathed, and you reached slow, and you took only what you could hold. I reached for it now, there in the dark by the water, the way he'd taught me. And this time, for the first time, it did not tear out of me like a flood. It came up my arm slow and cold, a thin thread of silver-white light along my fingers, no more than a candle's worth, and it held, trembling, for the length of 3 breaths before it guttered and left me sweating and light-headed with a thread of blood at my nose. A candle. After the wildfire that had nearly killed me in the battle, I had learned to call up a candle and hold it and put it down without it burning the house. There, he said it quiet the way you'd speak near a spooked horse. A month ago it threw you on your face, tonight you held it and let it go. That's not nothing, my lord, that's the whole of it in miniature. Everything after this is just more candle. He was quiet a moment. Though I'll tell you true, in 40 years I've never seen a hollow kindle a light at all. Whatever's locked in you, it's not on any ladder I know. Neither of us said the rest of it, that a candle would not win a fight, that I was still, by every measure that mattered out here, the weakest fighting man on my own rafts. But a candle I could control was worth more than a wildfire I could not, and I was learning slowly in blood and nosebleeds that this was the shape of the whole gift. It did not want to be seized. It wanted to be earned. Sarn's low whistle came up from the water. The rafts were loaded. The tide in the far channel had turned. It was time. I put out my candle and wiped the blood from my lip and went down to run a river in the dark. We went down the grey-water by night with the poles muffled and the salt under black reed mat, 6 rafts in a line, and Sarn in the lead one reading water I could not see. The worst of it was the bridge. There was no way to the sea that did not pass directly beneath Lord Harrow's toll bridge, the very span where he had smiled at me. And so the whole plan, the rafts and the reed and the drowned road, came down in the end to the simple animal business of sliding 6 loaded rafts under a sleeping enemy's floor without waking him. Sarn took us in along the deep shadow of the bank, where the bridge's own bulk blacked out the stars. Above us I could hear Harrow's watch, a gatehouse lantern, a bored voice, the scrape of a boot on stone, close enough that I stopped breathing. One shout, one dropped chain. That was all it would take. Halfway under, a watchman above us kicked a loose stone off the parapet, and it fell and struck the lead raft's reed deck with a soft, wrong thud, and I heard the man's voice change, heard him lean out over the dark water and call low, "Who's there?" And I felt the panic come up in me, and with it, unbidden, the fire, rising fast and wild the way it had in the battle, bright enough to light us all up like a beacon under his bridge and hang us before dawn. And I breathed. And I reached for it slow, the way Gareth had taught me by the water, and instead of letting it flare, I closed my hand on it and put it down, a candle, held, then quenched. And in the dark and the silence that followed, the watchman decided a river was a river, and a thud in the night was a fish or a bird or nothing, and he leaned back from the rail and I heard him yawn. And 6 rafts of the salt that was going to break his master's grip slid out the far side of Lord Harrow's bridge and into the open river beyond, and he never knew. It was the first time the sealed fire had helped me by staying down. I have thought since that it was the more important lesson. Then the river began to talk under the rafts, a low chattering hiss over hidden ground, and Sarn's whole body changed, and he said one word back down the line, quiet and hard, "Teeth." I never saw the teeth. That is the thing I remember most, that the shoal that could gut every raft we had and drown the salt, and the food, and the whole of it was completely invisible, a killing thing under black water, and the only chart for it was inside the head of one old man listening to the sound the river made as it broke over stone. Sarn pulled his lead raft into the hiss, and I heard him counting under his breath, not numbers, I realized, but a kind of song, a rhythm 40 years old. The water road remembered in his body, the way a tune lives in your hands long after you've forgotten you knew it. Left and hold and left and drive. He read the teeth by ear in the dark and called the line back down to the raft behind, and that raft called it to the next. so that all 6 of us threaded the same invisible needle one after another on a rope of an old man's voice. The 5th raft caught. I heard it, the grind of reed and frame on stone, the shoal taking hold of the belly of the thing, the raft slewing and the salt beginning to slide, a man crying out as the river tried to open the boat and take everything in it. And there was no time to reach it, and Might of 14 was no use 40 feet across black water, and I understood we were about to lose a 6th of everything and maybe a man with it. It was Sarn who saved it, and he saved it with knowledge, not strength, bawling across the water for them to stop poling, stop fighting it, let her swing, because a raft that fought the teeth broke and a raft that went slack rode up and off, and the terrified crew made themselves stop, and the river lifted the raft and shrugged it free, holed and half-swamped and afloat. We belayed her the rest of the way with our hands. We lost a corner of one load and no men at all. And then gray and sudden, the way it always came out here, the dawn and the river widening and the smell of it changing under a cold wind, salt and vast and open. The gray water let us out between 2 low headlands into a wide tidal reach, and there at the water's edge, gray and half-rotted and unmistakable, stood the bones of an old stone quay and a huddle of weathered buildings that Sarn named in a voice gone thick, Saltmouth, the coastal landing. The far end of the drowned road, where 40 years ago the Ashmarch had sold its salt to the sea, and where, if there was any justice at all in either of my lives, it was about to do so again. Saltmouth was not dead. That was the first gift the sea gave me. The landing had gone quiet when the water road closed, but it had not died, because the coast trade never entirely dies. A few fishing families, a chandler, and twice a month, a coasting ship working up the shore for whatever cargo the little ports could offer. One was in when we came down on the morning tide, and its master, a shrewd, weather-cured woman named Captain Maeve, watched 6 ugly reed rafts come out of a river everyone on that coast believed was closed, riding low under black mats, and she came down to the quay herself to see what fool had done the impossible. I peeled back the reed mat and showed her the salt. I have appraised a great many people since the Dominion first opened in my head, but I did not need it to read Captain Maeve's face when she ran good dry Ashmarch salt through her fingers. Salt was money on that coast, same as everywhere more, because the little ports up the shore had been buying it dear from middlemen for a generation, ever since the cheap Ashmarch salt vanished off the market. And here it was again, come back from the dead down a drowned river, offered by a desperate young lord with no middleman and no toll and no idea yet what it was truly worth. She tried to rob me on the price, of course. She was a trader. It would have been rude not to. But I had the register open in my head, the true worth of every sack laid out plain, and I had Osric's forward contract in my satchel to prove what the grain factor upriver already thought Ashmarch salt was worth. And I had the one thing no desperate frontier lord is ever supposed to have across a bargaining table, which was the exact number, and the patience to hold it. We settled well. Not at the coast's full price. I was new, and my rafts were ugly, and a first deal is a handshake more than a fortune. But at a price that put real coin in my hand for the first time since I had died under a bridge in another world, and opened a door to a market 100 miles long that did not have Lord Harrow standing in it anywhere. And the coin was not even the best of it. Because with Captain Maeve's silver in my satchel and the water road proven, the grain that Harrow had stranded at his bridge stopped being a hostage. I did not even need to pay his ruinous toll to free it. I sent word back upriver to Master Corliss by Maeve's own outrider. Bring the grain down to Saltmouth by the coast track, and load it onto the rafts for the run home. The same road the salt came out on. Corliss, who was a gambler and had just watched his gamble come in, did exactly that. The barley that was supposed to starve us into surrender came home to Duncairn down a river Harrow didn't own, and every sack of it was a sack he had been holding for ransom that was now simply gone from his hands, with nothing he could do about it and no one he could blame. We had food. We had coin. We had a road to the sea. And Lord Harrow still believed that morning that he had just watched Duncairn die. He learned the truth about a week later, and I was not there to see it, but Osric, who by now had built me a little web of ears the way he had once kept my father's, brought me the shape of it, and it was even better than I had let myself imagine. Harrow discovered the water road the way powerful men always discover the thing they overlooked, too late and all at once and in public. His toll receipts had not moved, but Ashmarch salt was suddenly on the coast market, cheap and plentiful, undercutting the very middlemen who paid him for the privilege. And when he sent men to find where it was coming from, they came back with the answer that a decade of his family's power had been built on a lie. The bridge was not the only way. It never had been. There was a river, and the river went to the sea, and the forgotten warden he had strangled had simply sailed around him. There was nothing he could do. That was the sweetest part and the most instructive. He could not toll a river he held no charter over. He could not call it banditry. I had broken no law, crossed no land of his, drawn no steel. He could not even complain loudly, because to complain was to announce to every lord on the frontier that the great chokehold of the Ashmarch, the toll that made House Harrow rich, could be walked around by any man clever enough to remember a river. His power had never been the bridge. It had been the belief that the bridge was the only way, and I had not broken his bridge. I had broken the belief, which is the only thing that ever truly holds a man's power up. So Lord Harrow did what small men do when they lose to someone they've decided is beneath them. He did not come at me himself. He went at someone bigger. Osric's ears put it together from 3 directions at once. A rider from Harrow's hall, moving fast and quiet. A summons answered. A name that had been sitting under this whole story since the imperial steel on a dead reaver's sword in the last light of my first battle. Harrow had taken his humiliation, and his knowledge of a rising warden who would not stay dead, to the one man on the frontier with the wealth and the patience and the reason to want the Ashmarch to stay a grave, the corrupt earl who ruled the whole march and everyone in it, the paymaster whose coin had bought the reavers, the smiling rot at the top of the whole rotten order out here. Earl Cadman Voss of Blackmore, my own overlord, and now, whether I had wanted it or not, my enemy in truth. I stood on the new quay at Saltmouth a month after they'd sent me here to vanish, with coin in my treasury and a road to the sea and 6 ugly rafts that had beaten a lord who'd held this frontier for 10 years. And I looked north and east toward Blackmore, where a far greater man was, that very evening being told my name for the first time, and I found again that I was not afraid. I had climbed 1 rung out of the grave. There were a great many left. And the men who owned the ladder had just noticed that someone they'd thrown away was climbing it. Good. Let them notice. I built better when I knew exactly where the next wall was, and I already knew where this one stood. The wall announced itself 11 days later in the shape of a single rider in good livery, on a good horse, carrying a folded square of paper that was worth more menace than 100 reavers. He came down the coast track to Duncairn, not the river. The great do not use the tradesman's road, even the one you built, and he did not dismount, and he did not ask my name, because a man who serves an earl has been trained to make a warden feel the difference. He simply held out the paper with its heavy black seal and waited, and let the whole village gather at a distance to watch their lord be summoned like a servant. I broke the seal. The hand inside was a clerk's, beautiful and cold, and the words were the most dangerous kind, which is to say courteous. The Earl of Blackmore extends his warm regard to Aldric Vale, Warden of the Ashmarch, and desires the pleasure of his company at Blackmore, that they may become acquainted as lord and vassal ought. His lordship trusts the warden will not disappoint him. Trusts you will not disappoint him, Osric read over my shoulder, in the flat, dry voice he used when he was frightened and would not show it. That is not an invitation, my lord. That is a man opening a door and standing well back from it. You are being called to Blackmore to be looked at, weighed, priced, and decided upon by the one power on this frontier who can end you with a signature and never touch a sword. He folded the paper. And you cannot refuse. Refuse a great lord's courtesy, and you have declared yourself in rebellion. He would be within his rights to march on you tomorrow, and half the frontier would ride with him for the sport of it. Gareth said nothing, but his hand had gone to the pommel of his sword the way it did, and Myra had come up from the pans with salt still on her hands and her jaw set hard, and Tam looked at me the way he'd looked at me across a burning village on the first night, as though if he watched closely enough he could keep me alive by will alone. They all knew. You did not walk into the seat of the man who had paid to have you murdered and expect to walk out. But Osric was right, I could not refuse, and more than that I did not want to. A wall you cannot see is worse than any wall you can. For a month I had fought an enemy made of imperial steel on a dead man's sword and coined behind a smiling neighbor a shape, a rumor, a paymaster. Now the paymaster had made the oldest mistake the powerful make. He had gotten curious. He wanted to see the rising Warden with his own eyes. Which meant that I, too, would get to see him, to take the measure of the man who owned the whole rotten order out here, and learn where the real wall stood, and what it was made of, and where a builder might one day bring it down. He wants to look at me, I said. Good, I'll let him. A man learns nothing about you from a distance that he can't unlearn the moment you're standing in his hall being useful and harmless and beneath his notice. I handed the summons back to Osric. Myra runs Duncairn while I'm gone, the pans, the trade, all of it. You have my word before the village. Bram keeps building. Kessa keeps her eyes on the flats and the road both. If I'm not back in 3 weeks. Don't. She said it flat and hard, the way she said everything that mattered. Don't do the speech where you tell us what to do when you're dead. You dug us water and you beat the toll that strangled us for 10 years. So go and be harmless and beneath his notice, and then come home, because we've a town to build and I'm not breaking in a fifth lord. It was, from Myra, very nearly a declaration of love, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so. I took Gareth, for the sword and the steadiness, and Osric, for the ears and the cold, clean mind, and I left the sealed fire and the soft body, and every weakness I owned behind the calm face I had learned to wear on Harrow's Bridge. And I rode east, toward Blackmore, to be weighed by the man who wanted me dead. Blackmore told me everything about Earl Cadman Voss before I ever laid eyes on him, because a man's holding is his true face, and I had learned to read a holding the way I read a river. We came to it after 3 days' ride, up out of the frontier into softer, richer country, and that was the first thing the Dominion showed me, laid over the land like an accusation. This was good ground. Fat fields, deep soil, real forests, a country that should have been one of the wealthiest in the empire. And it was wealthy for one man. Blackmore itself was a great gray castle grown fat on a hill, its walls new-faced, its banners rich, a lord's seat swollen with a decade of coin. But the villages we passed to reach it were as thin and hollow-eyed as Duncairn had been, and the difference between the two was the whole of my education in what I was fighting. The Ashmarch was poor because the ground was dead. Blackmore's villages were poor because the ground was rich, and every copper it made was bled uphill into that swollen castle, and left the people who grew it to starve in sight of the harvest. Duncairn had been failing. This was worse than failing. This was a domain being farmed. The people harvested along with the grain, kept just alive enough to keep producing, by a man who had discovered that a frontier's misery, properly managed, was more reliable than its prosperity. I understood, riding up that hill past those hollow villages, exactly why a thriving Duncairn had frightened him enough to spend imperial steel on it. It was not that my little salt town threatened his purse. It was that it was a living argument, proof, standing out on the salt flats for anyone to see, that a frontier lord could make his people fat and loyal instead of thin and beaten, and that everything Earl Voss had built his life on was a choice, not a law of the world. I was not a rival. I was a rebuke, and rebukes, unlike rivals, cannot be bought off. They can only be erased. They kept us waiting 2 days in Blackmore's cold outer hall, a deliberate insult, a warden left to cool his heels among the petitioners and the debtors, and I spent both of them being harmless and beneath notice and quietly reading everything. Which of the Earl's men were paid well and which were paid late? Which of his knights carried real aura and which carried only good armor, where the wealth flowed and where it pooled? Osric's ears did the rest. By the time they finally called my name, I knew more about the true state of Blackmore than the Earl knew about me, I hoped, and I had seen, twice across the crowded hall, a familiar well-fed figure in good furs watching me with a small private smile. Lord Harrow had come to Blackmore to watch me be broken. He would not have missed it for the world. I gave him a small, beaten, respectful nod, the nod of a defeated man to the neighbor who'd bested him, and I watched him enjoy it, and I filed his enjoyment away with everything else. Then the great doors opened, and a cold seneschal spoke my name and my insulting little title into the vast, rich hall beyond, and I went in to meet the man who owned my grave. Earl Cadman Voss was the most reasonable man I have ever wanted to kill. That was the trap of him, and I felt it close the moment I entered the hall, not a monster on a throne, not a sneering tyrant, but a handsome, silver-templed, immaculately courteous man in his 50s, who rose from his chair to greet a mere warden as though genuinely pleased, took my hand in both of his, and looked at me with warm, intelligent, entirely pitiless eyes. Warden Vale, at last. His voice was low and easy and made you want to be liked by it. Forgive the wait, the business of a frontier is endless as you're learning. Sit, sit. I confess I've been curious about you. A Vale son out on my Ashmarch. I knew your father a little, a hard man sound. And here you are doing remarkable things. Water from a dead flat, salt from a curse. A little river trade that's quite upset our poor Harrow. A flicker of a smile. You've made rather a stir for a man sent out there to be quiet. Every word of it was a knife wrapped in silk. A man sent out there to be quiet, he was telling me gently that he knew exactly what the Ashmarch was for and that I had failed to perform my one function, which was to die in it. I let the Dominion look at him while he talked, and what it returned was the most dangerous appraisal it had ever given me. Earl Cadman Voss, aura, blaze, guile, immense. Loyalty to you, hostile, hidden. Verdict. He has already decided. He has already decided. Not will decide. Not is weighing, decided. The warmth, the wine, the courtesy, the 2 days in the cold hall, all of it was theater performed over a conclusion the Earl had reached before I ever crossed his threshold. He had made up his mind that I was a threat to be removed. This meeting was not a judgment. It was a sizing. He was measuring how hard I would be to kill, how much noise I would make, whether I could be leashed cheaply or would have to be broken expensively. And the aura reading turned my stomach cold. Blaze. 2 full ranks above Gareth, a warrior who could kill a room in a body that ruled a march. Whatever else Earl Voss was, he was not a soft schemer I could outfight if it came to steel. He was a killer who had learned that killing was inefficient and had built a whole rotten philosophy on the discovery. So I did the only thing a candle can do in front of a bonfire. I did not let him see it burn. "You're kind, my lord, but you overpraise me," I said, and I made it the truth of a tired, in-over-his-head young man, because the most useful thing I owned in that hall was his contempt. I haven't done remarkable things. I've done desperate ones. A well because we were dying of thirst, salt because we were dying of hunger, the river because I couldn't pay Lord Harrow's toll and my people can't eat a charter. There's no ambition in it, my lord, only a man too stubborn to watch his village die, making it up as he goes and getting lucky. I let myself look young and out of my depth and grateful to be noticed. I'd be a poor vassal if I let you think me cleverer than I am. It was the performance of my life, and I watched it land, and I watched it not quite land, because a blaze does not rise to rule a march by being fooled by frightened young men, and something behind Voss's warm eyes stayed cool and unconvinced even as his mouth smiled and agreed. He let me have the role. He did not, I think, entirely buy it. But he filed it, the way I filed everything, as a thing that might be true, and a man who might be as small as he claimed, and that flicker of doubt that might, was the only thing I took out of Blackmore that was worth the ride. Then he set the hook, gently, the way he did everything. "Well, desperate or clever, you've built something, and a thing built on my march is my concern for your protection as much as my due." He swirled his wine. "The frontier is a dangerous place. Warden, reavers, worse things out of the blight. 3 of your predecessors, you'll recall, simply vanished. It would grieve me to lose a fourth and a Vale at that. So I mean to extend you my protection. My men will garrison your little town for its safety. My factors will handle your salt. The coast trade is treacherous for an amateur, and I'd not see you cheated. And a modest share of the yield to the march, naturally, for the security I provide. 2/3 should answer. The smile never wavered. You'll find me a generous protector, Warden, far kinder than the flats. I do hope you'll be sensible. Your predecessors weren't, and look. There it was, laid on the silk between us. Not a demand I could refuse, and not an offer I could accept. His soldiers in my town were a leash and a knife at once. His factors on my trade meant the water road I had bled to open would simply become another pipe bleeding uphill to Blackmore. 2/3 of the yield was the whole of my future handed to the man who wanted me dead, dressed as protection. And the veiled little coda, your predecessors weren't sensible, and look, was the reaver on the road and the imperial steel, and the three vanished lords all gathered into one soft, smiling threat. Take the leash, or be erased like the others, and no one will ever prove I lifted a hand. I had walked into Blackmore to find where the wall stood. I had found it. It was 2 ranks of aura and a decade of coin, and the whole weight of the Empire's rotten order, and it was smiling at me over good wine and telling me to be sensible. So I smiled back, and I bought the only thing a man in my position can ever buy from a man in his, which was time. My lord honors me beyond anything a warden could ask, I said, and bowed exactly as deep as the theater required. Such a kindness deserves a proper answer, not a hasty one. Grant me leave to return to Duncairn, put my poor accounts in order, and render you a full and honest reckoning of what little the march can offer its protector, done properly, as a Vale ought. You'll have my answer within the month. He let me have it. Of course he did. A month cost a blaze nothing, and a vassal asking leave to arrange his own surrender is a pleasing thing to a man like Voss. He rose and took my hand again in both of his, warm as a father, and wished me a safe road home with eyes that had already ordered it not to be, and I bowed my way out of that rich hall past Lord Harrow's small, satisfied smile, and did not let my own face change by a single degree until Blackmore was 3 hours behind us and the frontier wind was in my teeth again. Then Gareth, riding close, said quietly, "Well, my lord, what did you buy in there?" "A month," I said, "and the truth. He's going to erase Duncairn, Gareth. He decided it before I ever rode in. The protection, the factors, the 2/3, that's just the cheap way, the way that costs him nothing and looks like mercy. When I don't take the leash, he'll reach for the expensive way. And we've got 1 month to be ready for it, and a blaze and an earl's whole march on the other side of the ledger." I looked back once, toward the swollen gray castle on its hill of hollow villages. "Which means we stop building a town that survives and start building one that wins. Ride. We've a great deal to do and no time to do it in, and I've just promised the most dangerous man on the frontier an answer he is absolutely not going to like." I called the whole of Duncairn's true strength into Myra's cottage the night I got back, and I told them the truth, because I had learned in one life and confirmed in another that people will endure almost anything except being managed, and that a lie told to spare them is only a way of stealing the choice that is rightfully theirs. So I laid it out plain on Myra's rough table, all of it, the summons, the swollen castle on its hill of hollow villages, the 2/3 and the garrison and the factors, the soft smiling threat under it. And the thing the Dominion had shown me that I did not soften, that Earl Voss had decided to erase us before I ever crossed his threshold, that the protection was only the cheap way, and that when I refused it, as I was going to refuse it, he would reach for the expensive way, and the expensive way was the reaver on the road and the imperial steel and the 3 lords who simply vanished, done bigger and done to us. The cottage went very quiet. It was Call of all of them, the silent smith, who finally spoke. "Speaker, Call, then we're already dead. A month and then an earl's army. We can't fight that. Nobody can fight that." "No," I agreed. "We can't fight that, so we're not going to." I put my hand flat on the table. "Listen to me, all of you, because this is the whole of it. A man like Voss doesn't erase things because he hates them. He erases them because they're cheap to erase and dangerous to leave. A dying village on the flats is cheap. A Reaver band does it for a purse and no one ever asks a question. That's what we were. That's what he still thinks we are. I looked around the cottage, the smith, the drunk-turned-builder, the hard woman, the old salt runner, the boy who'd never left me, the knight, the steward. So we make ourselves expensive. We spend this month turning Duncairn into a thing that cannot be erased quietly, walls he'd have to break, men he'd have to bleed for. A name enough of the frontier knows that its sudden death would raise the exact questions Voss has spent 10 years avoiding. We don't have to beat his army. We only have to make killing us cost more than he's willing to pay in coin and blood and attention. That we can build. That I know how to build. I gave them the month and I gave it to them in pieces, each piece a person's own to carry, because a task shared out is a fear turned into work. Bram would raise a wall, a real one, stone on the firm ground north of the pans, engineered to make a charge bleed. Gareth would take the farmers who'd held a line once and drill them into men who could hold it again and win. Call would arm them. Myra would grow us more hands, more food, more of the belief that was our truest defense. Kessa and Sarn would be our eyes and our escape both. The flats and the water road watched day and night. Osric would fight the war I could not, the war of law and letter and rumor, and buy us every day of the month that cleverness could buy. And I would build the walls and find the men, and learn to hold the fire in my chest, because I was going to need all three before the month was out. A month ago you promised us water and gave it, Myra said into the quiet. Now you're promising us we can stand against an earl. That's a long way from a well, Aldric Vale. She looked at me hard. Then, grudging, certain, but you dug the well, so tell us where to put the wall. That was the night Duncairn stopped being a village I was saving and became a town that had decided to save itself. And I have thought since that Earl Voss, for all his aura and his coin and his terrible patience, never understood that this was the thing he could not erase. Not the walls, not the salt, but 200 people who had learned, one impossible week at a time, that they were worth fighting for. He'd spent his life proving people weren't. It made him strong and it made him blind, and I meant to make him pay for both. A month is nothing, and a month is everything, depending on whether the people spending it believe the thing they're building is theirs. Duncairns belong to them now, and they built like it. The wall came up out of the dead ground faster than any works I'd raised in either life, because Bram had learned the salt, and the stone the way Sarn knew the water, and because 400 pairs of hands that a month ago had nothing to do but be afraid now had a curtain of stone to raise, and a reason to raise it before the frost. It was not a castle. It was better than a castle for what we needed, a low, thick, cunning wall of dry-laid rubble and rammed salt earth, sited by me and Bram together along the one firm approach, curved so that anything charging it took fire from two sides, fronted by the same treacherous brine-rotten ground that had drowned the Reaver's horses, with the water road at our backs for supply and for escape. I did not build Duncairn a wall a great army couldn't take. No wall does that. I built it a wall that would cost a great army more men than a smiling earl could afford to lose out of sight of the empire, over a salt town he'd told everyone was already dead. Every course of stone was a coin added to the price of erasing us. And the people came. That was the thing I had not fully reckoned on, the thing that changed the whole arithmetic, because word of a thriving free town on the salt flats did not only reach Blackmore, it reached Blackmore's villages. It reached the hollow-eyed, harvested people I'd ridden past on the way to the Earl's Hall, and it reached the frontier's drifters and its deserters and its discarded, and it said, quietly, the most dangerous thing a rotten order can ever let its people hear. There is another way to live, and it is close, and its Lord will have you. They began to arrive in twos and threes down the coast track and the flats. A family fled from a Blackmore rent they couldn't pay, a runaway apprentice, a widow and her boys, and the Dominion read each of them as they came. And I took the ones with a gift the town needed and turned none of the rest away, because a town that turns away the desperate is only Blackmore with better manners. One of them mattered more than the rest, and I knew it before he reached the gate. The Dominion tagged him at 300 paces, a big, scarred, road-worn man in a soldier's cast-off gear, walking like a man who'd worn armor so long his body had forgotten how to stand without it. Rogan, deserter, man-at-arms. Aura, spark. 10 years under Blackmore's banner. Left in disgust. Knows Voss's men, Voss's ways. Loyalty, seeking, testing you. His name was Rogan, and he had spent 10 years as one of Earl Voss's soldiers, garrisoning the very hollow villages I'd ridden through, collecting the rents that starved them. Until the day he was ordered to do a thing he wouldn't, and walked off the Earl's service with nothing but his sword and his disgust, and drifted the frontier until he heard there was a warden out on the salt who fed his people instead of farming them. He came to test whether it was true. He had aura, a spark, a real fighting man's edge, more than any soul in Duncairn but Gareth, and he had 10 years of knowing exactly how Earl Voss's men fought, marched, thought, and broke. He was, in short, precisely the man I needed, walked in off the flats, disgusted into my hands by the very rot I was fighting. I did not have to recruit Rogan. I only had to be, when he arrived, the thing he'd walked 100 miles hoping was real. He watched Duncairn for 3 days, the wall, the pans, the drilling, the way the people carried themselves, and on the 3rd day he found me at the works and knelt in the salt without a word, and Gareth, watching, allowed himself the smallest grim smile, because a knight knows the worth of a second sword that has stood in a real line. Not everything that month was a gift. Voss's hand began to reach for us even before his month was up, small, deniable, patient. A shipment of iron coal had bought off the coast was delayed, and then lost. Master Corliss's next grain contract met a sudden, unexplained difficulty with his creditors. A coasting captain who'd taken our salt was warned off by men who didn't give names. Nothing you could call an act of war. Everything designed to strangle quietly, to remind me that the leash was still on offer and the alternative was already tightening. I felt the Earl's soft grip closing a finger at a time, and I built faster, and I sent Osric to work his letters and his ears, and I knew, the way you know a storm by the pressure before the wind, that the quiet squeeze was only the overture, and the real movement was still coming. I had a wall, a militia, a second sword, and a growing town. What I did not yet have was the one thing the Dominion had promised me and would not give. The fire in my chest on command when the walls finally failed and it came down, as it always came down out here, to what a man could do with his own 2 hands. That was still a candle, and a candle does not stop a blaze. The thing that changed it did not come from Blackmore. It came, the way the most important things on the Ashmarch always came, out of the blight. Kessa found it first, because Kessa found everything first, a wrongness on the western flats, 3 days before the Earl's month was out. She came in off the salt gray-faced, which I had never seen, and she did not run this time, because you do not run from the thing she'd seen. Some animal older than sense tells you not to turn your back on it. There's something on the west flat, by the deep salt. It's not a reaver, it's not a beast, it's wrong, Aldric. It moves wrong. It came up out of the blight and it's coming this way, slow, and everything it walks over dies, the salt goes black behind it. I've lived on these flats my whole life. I've never seen anything like it. The west flat. The west salt runs deeper than a village this old should allow. The first uncanny tiding the Dominion had ever given me, the one I'd filed away and never understood, turned over in my chest and finally showed me its shape. The salt hadn't been running deep by accident. Something under the blight had been pushing it, the way I'd half known and refused to think about, and now the something had surfaced, and it was walking toward my town. I took Gareth and Rogan and Kessa, and rode west into a country that got wronger with every mile, the salt going gray, then black, then a color I had no name for, the wind carrying a smell like a struck tomb. And I found it at the edge of the deep blight, and no words I own will make you see it, so I will only tell you what it did to the ground and leave the rest. It was vaguely a beast and vaguely a man and truly neither, salt-crusted and wrong-jointed, and where it set its weight the living salt dyed black and the air itself seemed to thin. And when it turned what it had instead of a face toward me, every rational thing I had built my 2 lives on told me to run. We did not run. There were 40 miles of open flat between it and Duncairn's new wall, and it was walking them, and I understood with a builder's cold certainty that a wall meant nothing to a thing that killed the ground it crossed. It had to be stopped out here in the wrong country by the 4 of us, and Gareth's ember and Rogan's spark were real and brave, and I saw within the first exchange not enough, because the thing did not fight like a beast or a man, and steel came away from it black and half-eaten, and it was between us, and it took Rogan off his feet with something that was not quite a blow, and reached for Kessa, and I stopped being able to afford a candle. I have tried many times to describe what happened to me then, and the closest I can come is this. I stopped reaching for the fire the careful way Gareth had taught me, and instead, with Kessa a breath from that reaching wrongness, I simply needed it wholly, with nothing held back and nothing afraid, and for the first time the seal did not tear and it did not flood and it did not throw me down. It opened. The silver-white came up through me like a tide coming home, cold and vast and mine, and it did not burn me because for one clean moment I was not fighting it. I was asking, and it answered my whole arm and the blade in my hand sheathed in living silver light, and I was fast, and I was strong, and I was, for the length of that one impossible engagement, a warrior. I put myself between the wrongness and the girl, and I cut, and the silver fire bit where steel had failed, and the thing that killed the ground recoiled from my light, flinched from it, the way nothing on that flat had flinched from anything, as though the silver in me was the one thing in the world it feared. I drove it back into the blight. I don't fully know how. Between my fire and Gareth's cold discipline and Rogan dragging himself up to stand at my shoulder bleeding, we heard it enough that it turned and went back into the deep gray country it had crawled out of, and the black stopped spreading, and the 4 of us stood in the ruined salt in the failing light, alive, and I felt the fire go out of me, not thrown down this time, not blood and collapse, but spent, the honest exhaustion of a muscle used to its true limit for the first time. The Dominion, when it steadied, showed me a thing it had never shown me before, and I stood in that dead country and read it 3 times before I let myself believe it. Aura, hollow to spark. The seal has yielded. First rung climbed. Note, the blight fears your flame. Spark. After a month of candles and nosebleeds, I had climbed the first rung of the ladder every warrior on this frontier was ranked by, the ladder I'd started at the very bottom of, the hollow boy everyone had mocked. It was 1 rung. Rogan was a spark, Gareth an ember, Voss a blaze. The true monsters of the world stood ranks above that in a place I couldn't yet imagine. 1 rung was almost nothing, measured against what was coming. But it was not the rung that made me stand a long time in that dead gray country while the others waited. It was the last line. The blight fears your flame. The thing that had killed 3 lords and pushed the salt deep, and crawled out of the west to walk on my town had looked at the silver fire sealed inside a discarded Vale sun, and it had been afraid. I did not know what that meant. I would spend a long time not knowing. But I understood, standing there, that the story I thought I was in, a young lord against a corrupt earl, salt in walls and coin, was sitting on top of a far older and stranger story, and that the sealed gift the Dominion had put in my chest was not perhaps only about killing earls. I put that away too, colder than all the rest, because Earl Voss's month was up in 3 days, and whatever the blight feared, the earl was the wall in front of me now, and I had promised him an answer. It was time to give it. The answer I sent Earl Voss took Osric and me 2 full days to write, and there was not a single word of defiance in it, and it was the most dangerous thing I did in that whole dangerous month. Because I understood by then the exact nature of the trap I was in, and I understood that the way out of it was not to refuse the earl. Refusal was what he wanted, the clean, bright treason that would let him ride on Duncairn with the law at his back and the frontier for an audience. A defiant warden is a rebel, and rebels can be erased in daylight gratefully by everyone. No. The way out was to give Earl Voss an answer so perfectly, insufferably loyal that saying no to it would make him the one breaking faith. So we gave him one. In Osric's most beautiful clerk's hand, sealed with the veil raven copied. This was the whole of the trick, not once but 4 times, with the copies dispatched by 4 separate riders to 4 places that mattered. To Blackmore, yes, but also to the Crown's own frontier justiciar, to the neighboring Count of Highmore, and to the chapter house that kept the March's charters. And the letter said, in the warmest and most correct language the Empire owned, that Warden Aldric Vale gratefully accepted the protection and lordship of his most gracious Earl, that he acknowledged, as a loyal and law-abiding vassal, every lawful due the Crown's own charters set upon the Ashmarch, that he enclosed a full and honest reckoning of the March's yield, and would render its proper tribute to the last copper, on time, forever. And that he humbly begged only that his lordship's generous offer of a garrison and factors, being above and beyond what any charter required, be deferred, as a poor frontier town could not in conscience burden its beloved earl with the cost of quartering his soldiers when it was already so eager to serve him faithfully at no expense to his purse at all. Every word was a knife, and every knife was sheathed in honey. I had accepted Voss as my lord, which cost me nothing, and denied him his rebel. I had bound myself to pay the lawful tribute, a real, modest, chartered due, a fraction of his 2/3, and by naming it in a document sent to the justiciar and the charter house I had quietly made it the only tribute he could now demand without being seen to extort a loyal vassal in front of the Crown. And I had refused his garrison and his factors, the leash and the knife, not with a no, but with a smiling excess of loyalty so correct that to insist on them now was to admit, on the record, that protection had never been protection at all. I had not defied the Earl. I had made myself the model of a faithful vassal, in writing, in 4 hands, in front of exactly the people whose attention Earl Voss had spent 10 years avoiding. And in doing so, I had raised the price of erasing Duncairn from a purse and a reaver band to a lie the whole frontier would see him tell. Osric read the finished thing over one last time, and set it down, and looked at me with something in his dry face I had not earned from him even at the well. "I have written for great men for 30 years, my lord," he said quietly. "I have never once written a letter that made a great man's cruelty illegal. You have not refused him. You have made his own weapon, the law, the appearance of things, the record, into your wall." A pause. "He will be more dangerous now, not less. A man like Voss does not mind being resisted. He minds being outdone. But you have made it cost him. You have made it cost him a great deal." I had, and I knew, sealing those 4 copies, exactly what I had bought and exactly what I had spent. I had denied Earl Voss the cheap, clean, lawful kill. Which meant that when he came, and he would come, because a Blaze does not suffer being outdone by a boy he sent out to die, he would have to come the expensive way, the deniable way, the way that could not wear his colors, hired steel and reaver coin, and a night attack on a frontier town that the morning could be made to blame on the blight and the barbarians and the general danger of a lawless march. He could no longer erase Duncairn as its earl. He would have to try to murder it as no one at all. Which was a war I could actually fight, because a murderer, unlike an earl, has to send men through a wall. I did not intend to face Earl Voss alone, and the answer we'd sent had told me exactly where to look for the one thing I still lacked, which was a friend with an army. The Count of Highmore had received a copy of my loyal little letter, and that was not an accident. I had sent it to him for the same reason I sent one to the justiciar, to be seen, but also because of a thing Osric's ears and my own reading of the Blackmore Road had told me. Highmore was the county that bordered the Ashmarch to the south, solvent and old and respectable, and its count, a careful man named Varon, did not love Earl Voss. No one who bordered Voss loved him. A rich neighbor is a threat, and Voss's whole way of ruling was to weaken everything around him until only Blackmore stood tall. A strong, thriving, loyal Duncairn sitting on the Earl's western flank was, to Count Varon, a very interesting thing indeed. a counterweight to Voss that Varen himself had not had to raise, pay for, or answer for. So I wrote to Highmore a second time, past the formal copy, a real letter careful, offering nothing dangerous and hinting at everything. That the Ashmarch was rising, that its warden was a loyal man and a builder, not a rebel, that a friendship between neighbors who both, perhaps, found the Earl of Blackmore's ambitions tiresome might be to the great mutual advantage of both, in trade first and in other things as the seasons turned. I did not ask Count Varen to cross his earl. I only lit a small lamp in his window and let him decide whether to come to it. The answer, when it came, was cautious to the point of cowardice and exactly as much as I'd hoped for, a short, correct note in a different hand than the Count's, that promised nothing, committed to nothing, and yet troubled itself to reply at all, which a man wanting no part of me would not have done. It was signed, not by the Count, but on his behalf by his daughter, the lady who kept his correspondence, and Osric's ears reported a great deal else at Highmore besides. A young woman said to be sharper than her father and twice as ambitious, and to run the county's politics from behind his chair. I did not meet her that season, but I marked the name, and I marked the hand, quick, precise, a mind showing through the courtesy the way mine showed through Osric's, and I thought, there. That is a door, and behind it is someone who thinks. When the time comes, that is where I knock. For now it was only a lamp in a window, and it did not stop the Earl's grip from closing. Voss's squeeze grew teeth as his month ran out. A proper blockade now, his men turning back wagons on the coast road. Warnings that carried Blackmore's weight to every trader who'd touched our salt. Corliss's credit crushed. Captain Maeve herself sent word that she dared not run our cargo again while the Earl's displeasure was on it. The water road still ran, and the salt still moved, but thinner, harder at worse prices, and I could feel the town's new prosperity being throttled a hand at a time even as we built. A lesser Voss would have simply come with soldiers. This one strangled first, patiently, because he wanted me weak before he sent his deniable steel. A town half-starved again and half abandoned by its frightened trade partners is a town that falls in a night and raises no questions in the morning. He was good at it. I will not pretend he wasn't, and I might have outbuilt the squeeze given a season. I did not have a season, because the Earl was not only squeezing us from the outside. He had, I was about to learn, already reached a hand inside my walls, and it was holding a knife. His name was Hugh, and I had let him through my own gate a fortnight before, and the Dominion had read him true the day he came, and I had not listened closely enough to the part that mattered. He'd arrived with the refugees, a quiet, decent-seeming man fled from one of Blackmore's hollow villages, good with animals, quick to work, grateful. The Dominion had tagged him honest and useful, and it had shown me one more line I'd noted and set aside in the rush of 100 arrivals. Loyalty, torn, something held. I'd read it as an ordinary frontier grief, a man who'd left something behind. I had been too busy building a wall against the enemy outside to look hard at the enemy had already sent in. It was Kessa who caught it, because Kessa watched people the way she watched the flats, for the small wrongness that means a predator. She came to me quiet and troubled and said that Hugh went out past the pans at dusk more than a man had cause to, toward the old signal rise on the eastern flat, and came back with nothing, and that twice she'd seen a light up there after a small, shielded, deliberate light, answering something in the dark to the east, toward Blackmore. We took him that night gently at the base of the rise, with the shuttered lantern still warm in his pack, and he did not fight, and he did not lie once we had him, because the truth came out of him like water from a cut. Earl Voss's men had come to his village before he fled, and they had not let him flee, not truly. They had taken his daughter, a girl of 9, to Blackmore for her safety, and told Hugh where the new free town on the salt was, and what he was to do there, and what would happen to the child if he did not. He had come to Duncairn not as a refugee but as a knife, mapping our wall's weak seam, counting Gareth's spears, and this was the blow, this was the thing that had nearly killed us all, reporting the water road, the inlet, the rafts, the drowned channel to the sea. Earl Voss now knew about the one road I'd thought was mine. He knew our supply and our escape and our secret, because a frightened father had traded them for a 9-year-old girl, and I could not even hate him for it because I knew, looking at his ruined face in the lantern light, that I would have done exactly the same and worse for anyone I loved. Myra wanted him hanged, and she was not wrong by any law I knew. Gareth said nothing, which was Gareth's way of saying the same. And I stood there in the cold with a traitor at my feet who had handed my enemy the keys to my town, and I thought about Earl Voss, who made men into knives by holding the people they loved, and who had built his whole rotten power on the simple discovery that a man with something to lose will do anything, and I understood that this was the exact thing I had come to the frontier to fight. Not the Reavers, not the Blight. This, the making of good men into weapons by the cruelty of powerful ones. So I did not hang Hugh. I want to be honest that it was not only mercy, it was also the coldest strategy I had, and the two were, for once, the same road. I knelt down in front of the man who had betrayed us, the way I knelt in front of every broken soul this frontier handed me, and I asked him the only question that mattered. "If I could get your daughter out of Blackmore," I said, "would you serve me instead of him?" He wept. It is not a comfortable thing to watch a grown man weep, and I made myself watch all of it, because a lord who makes such a promise had better be sure of the cost of it. I did not yet know how I would take a child out of the swollen castle of a blaze who wanted me dead. But I knew that Earl Voss believed he was still feeding him lies through Hugh's shuttered lantern, and a spy the enemy trusts, who now serves you, is worth more than any wall. I had in one night lost the secret of the water road and gained a voice speaking directly into Earl Voss's ear that would, from now on, say exactly what I wanted the Earl to hear. It was the traitor's light, still burning up on the eastern rise, that told me it had already come too late for the water road, and nearly too late for all of it. Because when Kessa slipped up to the signal rise the next dusk to send Earl Voss his first piece of my false news, she came back at a dead run, gray-faced for the second time in a month, with the thing the light had been meant to answer already gathering on the eastern dark. "They're coming. Not soldiers, reavers, a whole host of them more than the last time by 3, and men with them, hard men, sellswords in no colors, camped a half-day east and moving at dawn," she swallowed. "The Red Chief's at the head of it, Aldric, the one from the first night. Voss bought him back and he brought everyone. The expensive way, the deniable steal, a reaver host and a company of colorless sellswords bought with Blackmore coin, coming in the dark to murder a town its earl would mourn beautifully in the morning. He knew the water road now, so there was no escape by the river he didn't already watch. He'd strangled our trade so we'd fight it hungry, and he'd sent enough steel to be sure. I had a wall, a militia, 2 swords with aura and my own new spark, a town that had decided to live, and one night to make ready. It was, by a wide margin, the worst set of odds I had faced in either of my lives. And I stood on the new wall in the last light and looked east toward the gathering dark, and I felt the old cold certainty settle over me, the engineer's certainty, the builder's calm, because a siege is only a problem, and a problem is only a wall, and I have always been able to build once I can find the ground. I turned to Gareth, and Rogan, and Myra, and Bram, and the town at my back. "All right," I said. "They think they're coming to murder a village in the dark. Let's show them what we built instead. To the wall, all of it now. We've one night, and I know exactly what to do with it." The first thing I did with that night was the thing Earl Voss would never have thought to do, because Earl Voss had never in his life had to win a fight he was supposed to lose. I used the enemy's own knowledge of me as the first weapon in the wall, because Voss knew about the water road now. Hugh had given it to him before Kessa ever caught the shuttered lantern, the inlet, the drowned channel, the rafts, the whole secret back door of the town. And a commander who has bought a spy's map does exactly what the map tells him. He sends his best men through the door he thinks you've left open. So while the reaver host came at my wall in the front, roaring, obvious, I was certain, the way you are certain of a load a structure cannot bear, that the Red Chief's sellswords, the disciplined professional steel that was the real threat, would come up the grey water in the dark to take us from behind, through the river door Hugh had sold them. So I gave the door to Sarn. The old salt runner and I spent the first hours of that night turning the drowned road into a drowned grave. Sarn knew the greywater the way I knew a lode diagram. Every narrows, every shoal, every place the channel pinched, and above all the teeth, that killing shoal that no man who didn't know it by sound could pass in the dark. We staked the narrows below the teeth with sharpened timber under the water line, angled downstream so a boat could pass up but never turn and run down. We laid Call's caltrops on the 2 landing spots a force would have to use. And we set fire rafts, the ugliest, most beautiful things we built that night, reed and pitch and Call's oil, moored in the dark above the teeth on a slip line, so that when the enemy's boats were committed into the narrows, past the stakes, feeling blind for the shoal they didn't know the sound of, Sarn had only to cut one rope and send fire down the black water into a channel they could neither run down through the stakes nor pole up through the flame. Voss thought the water road was our undefended back. Because I had flipped his spy, I knew that he knew, and I turned the thing he'd stolen into the exact place I most wanted his best men to be. And through Hugh's own shuttered lantern that same night, I told Earl Voss a lie. Kessa carried it up to the signal rise and flashed it east to the waiting host in the trader's own code. The walls weak at the north seam, the well side. The town musters there. The river's watched by 3 old men. Every word of it an invitation. Come at the north seam where I had, in fact, built my wall strongest and hidden Rogan's best spears. Send your good men up a river held by 3 old men, and a fire I hadn't mentioned. I fed the Earl the battle I wanted in the voice of the spy he trusted, and I have thought since that this was the truest lesson of the whole long night, that a wall of stone is a fine thing, but a lie in the enemy's own ear, told in a voice he's chosen to believe, is worth more than any 3 courses of rubble. The rest was the honest work of a siege, and we did it till dawn. Bram's wall manned. The brine-rotten killing ground before it, seeded with Call's caltrops and a hidden staked ditch, curved so a charge took fire from 2 sides. Gareth on the wall's right, Rogan on the left, each with a corps of the men they drilled. The pan's great store of salt heaped as a last redoubt. The town's children and old and hurt gathered into the strongest houses under Myra's word, because Myra had buried 3 lords' worth of the alternative and would bury no more. And Tam, who I could not keep from a wall any more than I could keep the tide from a shore, beside me, where he had been since a burning village on the first night. Gripping a spear, he barely knew how to hold and grinning at me like it was a festival, because that was Tam, and it was the bravest thing on the whole wall. I walked the line once in the last of the dark, the way I'd learned a lord must, and I did not give them a speech about glory, because these were not men who fought for glory. They were a smith and a net mender and a widow's sons and farmers who a season ago had nothing to defend. I told them the only true thing, which was that everything behind the wall was theirs, that they had dug it and built it and made it out of a graveyard with their own hands, and that the men coming in the dark had been paid to take it because a fat lord on a hill could not stand the sight of people who were not afraid. And then the east went gray, and the gray filled with the low thunder of a great many feet and hooves on dead ground, and the red chief's host came out of the dawn onto the killing floor I had built for it. Speaker, Aldric hold, I said down the line, quiet, the way Gareth had taught me. Let the ground do the first of it. Hold. The ground did the first of it, exactly as I had built it to. The Reaver host came the way Reavers always came, fast, roaring, sure that speed and terror would carry a starving village in one rush, and they hit the brine-rotten killing floor at the run, and the floor took them the way it had taken their kin in the first battle, worse now, because I'd had a month to make it worse. Horses screamed and folded on the hidden caltrops. The front rank went down into the staked ditch under the ones behind. The curve of Bram's wall funneled them into a throat where Gareth's right and Rogan's left poured fire and spears into them from 2 sides at once, and for the first minutes it was not a battle. It was a harvest, and I stood on the wall and directed it the way I'd once directed a pour. Not fighting, reading, seeing where the load gathered, and where the line bent and sending word down to shift a knot of spears here, to give ground there so the enemy's weight fell into the killing throat and not against the wall. I felt it happen even in the middle of it. The thing Gareth had spent a month trying to put in me, the shift from a man who gives an order and watches 3 farmers look at each other, to a man whose word moved a wall of 200 as one body. Command is not shouting. It is seeing, faster than the men in it can see, and being obeyed because you have already been right enough times that they no longer stop to doubt. I had been right about the well and the water road and the wall, and now, in the roar and the blood, they simply did what I said the instant I said it, because I had earned one impossible week at a time, the one thing that no aura and no coin can buy, their belief that I knew where the ground was. But the Red Chief was not a fool, and I had never thought he was, and the Reaver rush was never the true attack. It was the noise that hid the knife. Even as the host broke on my killing floor, the chief was pulling his real strength wide and back, the colorless sellswords, the disciplined professional steel, and I saw them peel off toward the north seam, toward the weak seam Hugh's lantern had sold them where I'd hidden Rogan's best, and I saw a second column, smaller, harder, slip away east and north toward the river, toward the water road, toward the undefended back door held by 3 old men. They had believed the lie. Both lies. And I stood on my wall with the harvest roaring below me, and felt the whole shape of the battle turn on the thing I'd whispered into my enemy's ear in a traitor's voice. And I sent the runner to Sarn with the single word we'd agreed on, and I did not let myself smile, because men were dying under me, and some of them were mine. Down at the river, in the gray light, Earl Voss's best sellswords pulled hard up the greywater toward the town's soft back, past the staked narrows that let them up and would not let them down, feeling blind in a channel none of them knew for a shoal they'd been told 3 old men guarded. And old Sarn, alone in the reeds with a knife and a slip line and 40 years of a drowned road in his hands, waited until the whole column was committed into the throat above the teeth, past the stakes. And then he cut the rope and sent fire down the black water. I did not see it. I only saw, minutes later, the pillar of oily smoke go up over the reeds to the north, and heard, under the roar of my own wall, a different kind of screaming carry thin across the flats. The sound of professional steel trapped in a burning channel it could not run down and could not pole up, in water it could not cross, dying for a fat lord's coin in a place a net mender everyone had pitied had made into a grave. The best of Earl Voss's deniable army died at the river without ever laying a hand on my wall, killed by an old man and a fire and a lie, and it was the single most important thing that happened that day, and almost no one on either side ever saw it. But a battle is not a diagram, and the part you plan is never the whole of it, and while I was winning at the river and holding at the wall, the Red Chief found the one seam I had not sealed. And he found it because he was brave and canny, and had a personal, patient hatred of the town that had beaten him once, and he came for me himself. He came at the wall's join, where Bram's new stone met the old burned palisade of the first battle. The one seam I'd known was weak and run out of month to fix, the one place the load gathered that I could not fully carry, and he came not with the mob but with a wedge of his hardest reavers behind a wall of shields, straight into the weak join, ignoring the killing floor, taking his losses and driving through them, because the Red Chief had understood the thing Earl Voss never would. That you do not beat a builder by charging his wall. You beat him by finding the one course he had to leave unfinished and putting your whole weight on it before he can. The seam broke. I felt it go the way you feel a beam go, a wrongness in the whole structure before the crack. And then the old palisade stove inward and the Red Chief's wedge was through, inside the wall, into the town, and the harvest at the killing floor meant nothing now, because the enemy was past the ground I'd built to stop him and into the streets where I'd built nothing but homes. And it cost us, there in the breach, the price I had known all night we might have to pay and had prayed we wouldn't. Rogan reached the seam first, Rogan the deserter, the spark, the second sword who'd walked 100 miles to find a lord worth serving and served him for exactly 1 month. And he threw himself into the broken join to hold it while Gareth's men wheeled to plug it. And he held it. He held it long enough, and it killed him. I saw it happen and could not reach it, 40 feet and 100 men away, exactly as I had not been able to reach the raft on the teeth, exactly as might had never once let me reach the thing that mattered in time. He went down in the breach he'd sealed with his own body, and the men he'd bought that month with his standing there died closing the gap behind him, and the seam held because a man I'd known for 30 days had decided my town was worth his life. I did not have time to grieve him. That is the true, ugly arithmetic of a wall, and I have never made my peace with it, that the men who buy you the seconds you need die in the buying, and the only way to honor the purchase is to spend the seconds well. I marked Rogan's face, the way I'd made myself mark Edrin's over the first battle, and I put it with the others, and I turned to the thing that had broken my seam and killed my second sword, and now stood in the smoke of my streets looking for me with a red-painted face and a patient, personal hate. The Red Chief had come through my wall to find me. And the Dominion, cold and clear even now, told me what I already knew in my bones, that he was a spark and more, a war chief who'd killed better men than me for 20 years, and that I was still under the silver fire and the hard-won month, a soft scholar with a might that a real warrior would laugh at. But I was a spark now too. And I had learned, out on the wrong gray flats with the blight recoiling from my light, that the fire in me did not answer to fear or to strength. It answered to need. And standing in the smoke of the town 200 people had bled to build, watching the thing that had come to murder it turn its red face toward me. I had never in either of my lives needed anything so much. "You want the lord of this place," I said, and I stepped over the rubble of my own broken seam to meet him, and I let the silver come up my arm slow and cold and whole. "You've had to come a long way through my town to find him. Let me save you the rest of the walk." He almost killed me in the first 3 exchanges, and I want to be honest about that, because the stories tell it wrong. They tell you the hero's hidden power makes him the equal of the master, and it does not at first, not for a long time. The Red Chief had killed men for 20 years and I had held a sword for 1 month, and aura or no aura, the gap between us was a chasm, and he showed it to me at once. He came in fast and I brought the silver up and met him, and it was like a boy meeting a landslide. He turned my blade, opened my shoulder to the bone, and had the second stroke coming for my neck before I even understood I'd been hit, and if the silver fire had been only strength, only speed, I would have died in the rubble of my own wall in the first 10 heartbeats. But the fire in me was not only strength. I had learned that out on the gray flats that it answered to need, and that need for me had never once been about killing. It had been about seeing. Appraisal, the well, the water road, the battle read like a load diagram. Everything I had ever been good at in either life was the same single gift wearing different clothes. I saw the true shape of a thing faster than the men around me could, and I acted on it before they knew it was there. And bleeding in the rubble with a war chief's blade at my throat, the silver fire poured that gift into my eyes instead of my arm, and for one impossible, stretched, silver instant I saw the Red Chief the way I saw a river. The old wound in his left knee that made him plant that leg wrong, the half-beat his shield dropped after a heavy stroke, the 20 years of habit that made a master predictable to anyone fast enough to read him. I could not outfight him. But I could outsee him, for as long as the fire held, and a man who sees the next 3 blows before they land does not need to be the better swordsman. He only needs to be there when the master is not. So I stopped trying to beat him and started trying to read him, and I gave ground through the rubble of my own broken seam, my ground I'd built and knew to the stone, and I let him drive me, and I made him plant the bad knee on the loose rubble I backed him onto, and when his shield dropped that half-beat after a stroke meant to end me, the silver blade was already where his habit had told me it would be a heartbeat before he knew it himself. I did not kill him. I could have. The fire wanted to. I put it into his sword arm and his bad knee instead, and took his blade and put him down into the rubble of the wall he'd broken, and stood over him with the silver guttering out of me and my own blood sheeting down my arm and my vision going white at the edges. And the Red Chief looked up at a soft scholar he'd have laughed at a month ago, holding a fire he couldn't understand, and something in his hard painted face changed. "Speaker, Aldric, the lord who paid you," I said when I could speak, "will deny he ever knew your name. He's already denying it. You bled your men on my wall for a man who will mourn my death beautifully and let yours go unremarked. I know exactly how that feels, being spent by a great man and left in the dirt." I let the last of the fire go and stood there swaying, a beaten, bleeding boy who had somehow won. "Your fight was never with us. Yield and live, and I'll show you what your paymaster never would, what your worth actually is." He looked at me a long moment, this reaver who'd burned my village on the first night and come back for it twice. And whatever he saw, the fire, or the mercy, or only a man who'd finally beaten him on ground of his own making, he let go of the knife he'd been reaching for with his good hand, and he yielded, because even a barbarian war chief knows the difference between a lord who wants him dead and one who wants him worth something, having spent a lifetime under the first kind. I had come through the whole of that battle with a wall and a lie and a fire I barely held, but I ended it the way I ended everything out there, not by killing the man in front of me, but by showing him he'd been thrown away by someone smaller than he was, and offering him the one thing the rotten order never did. It is, I have come to believe, the only weapon I have ever truly owned, and it has never once failed me the way steel has. A battle breaks the way a wall breaks, not gradually, but all at once, when the load finally finds the seam. The Red Chief's fall was the seam. His host had been thrown onto my killing floor and harvested. His best sellswords had died in a burning channel at the river without laying a hand on the town. And now the chief himself was down, taken alive in the rubble by the soft, young lord their paymaster had promised would die easy. It was too much wrong too fast for men who had come for cheap plunder and a fat lord's coin, and reavers do not die for coin when the coin's bet has clearly lost. The word went through them the way water goes through a broken form. The chief is down, the river's a grave, the wall won't fall, run. And they ran. They caught what horses they could and streamed back east into the dawn they'd come out of, and my militia, Gareth's farmers, who a season ago had never stood in a line, held the wall and let them go, because a wise man does not chase a broken enemy off his own killing ground into the open where numbers come back. We had held. I stood in the smoke and the wreck of my own streets and made myself understand it, the way you make yourself believe a structure is standing after you were sure it would fall. Duncairn had faced the deniable murder Earl Voss sent to erase it in the dark, and it had not been erased. The wall stood. The town stood. The people who'd built it out of a graveyard stood on it, filthy and bleeding and alive, looking down at a field of a broken host, and a sound went up from them that I had never heard from Duncairn before and would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. Not a cheer. They were too spent for a cheer. A kind of low, shaking, disbelieving roar. The sound of 200 people who had been told their whole lives that they were nothing, discovering all at once that they had stood against an earl's steel and won. I did not feel triumphant. I have never once felt triumphant standing in the aftermath of a thing I built to kill men, and I have come to distrust lords who do. I felt the wound in my shoulder and the fire's cold ashes in my chest, and the specific, particular weight of the seam that had broken, and the man who had died closing it. Because we had won, and winning has a price, and the price was lying in the breach where he'd fallen, and I had known his name for exactly 1 month. We buried Rogan on the 3rd day, in the good ground inside the wall he'd died to hold, and I dug part of the grave myself with my sound arm, because a lord who lets other men dig for his dead has not understood what he's asking of them. I had known him 30 days. A deserter who'd walked 100 miles on a rumor that somewhere on the salt there was a lord who fed his people instead of farming them, who'd watched us for 3 days and knelt in the salt without a word, and given me his sword and his 10 years of knowing the enemy, and then given me his life in a broken seam so that Gareth's men could wheel and hold. 30 days. And I want to say a true thing about grief, the truest thing I learned out there, because the stories get it wrong the way they get everything wrong. They'll tell you a lord must not weep for a man he barely knew, and that's half right, and it's the dangerous half. I did not weep for Rogan the way you weep for a brother of 20 years, but I had learned since the first battle and the man named Edrin that there is a grief you do owe a man who dies for you after 30 days, and it is not tears, it is attention. It is standing at the grave and making yourself know exactly what was spent and exactly what it bought, and refusing to let the arithmetic of a wall turn a man into a number. I had made myself learn Edrin's face. I made myself learn Rogan's, and the 11 others we buried inside the wall that week, one at a time by name, because the day I could not be bothered to was the day I would have become Earl Voss, who had never in his life learned the name of anyone who died for him. Tam stood beside me at the grave, quiet for once, no grin. Myra on my other side, dry-eyed and hard as always, though I saw what it cost her. And Hugh the traitor, whom I had not hanged, stood at the edge of it all, because I had let him stand there. Because a man who had nearly sold us all to save a 9-year-old daughter had in the end fed Earl Voss exactly the lie I'd told him to. And that lie had killed the sellswords at the river and saved every soul at this graveside, and I had made him a promise I meant to keep. When you're healed, I told him quietly over Rogan's grave, we're going to get your girl out of Blackmore. I don't know how yet, but a man who held his nerve and lied to a blaze for me while his own child was the price, that's a man I'd cross a kingdom for, so we'll get her. You have my word before the dead. He could not answer. He only nodded and wept, and I let him, and I stood at the grave of a man I'd known a month in the town he'd died to save, and I understood the way you understand a thing all at once that you've been circling for a long time, that this was what I was actually building out here. Not walls, not salt, not a realm even though it would become one. I was building a place where a man's worth was not measured by the great lord who owned him, and where the men who died for it were known, and that this, precisely this, was the thing Earl Voss and his whole rotten order could not abide and could not defeat, because it was not a wall they could break or a purse they could empty. It was an idea, standing on a salt flat, with a name for every one of its dead. Earl Voss had sent his deniable steel to murder a village in the dark. He had instead made it into something far more dangerous than a village. He had just made it a cause, and I was about to make sure that the whole frontier, the crown, the Count of Highmore, the charter houses, every lord who'd ever bled uphill into Blackmore, knew exactly whose coin had paid for the attempt. The Earl had come at us in the dark so that the morning could blame the blight. I was going to give the morning a very different story to tell. The most dangerous thing I did after the battle was not fought with a wall or a fire. It was written, in Osric's beautiful cold hand, and it was the moment I stopped being a warden who survived Earl Voss and became a warden who could hurt him. Because Voss had made one assumption, and the whole of his deniable murder had rested on it, that the dead tell no tales. A reaver host in colorless sellswords, come in the dark, gone by morning, who was to say whose coin had paid them? The frontier is lawless, barbarians raid. A town dies and the great protector shakes his head sadly and moves on. That was the story he'd paid for. But the dead on my killing floor were not silent, because the dead carry purses, and the purses of Earl Voss's colorless sellswords were full of good Blackmore minted silver, fresh from the Earl's own mint, the kind of coin no reaver ever saw and no frontier drifter ever spent. And the Red Chief was not dead at all. He was in my keeping alive, abandoned by the paymaster who'd already begun denying his name, and a proud man discarded by a small one will tell you a great deal, if you are the one who spared him and offered him his worth. So Osric and I built, out of the silver and the chief and the captured survivors and the dead, a thing more dangerous to Earl Voss than any breach in his walls. The truth, assembled, witnessed, and made into a weapon he could not answer. And then this was the whole of the art, the thing I had learned from my own loyal letter a month before. I did not accuse him. To accuse a blaze and an earl outright was to hand him a duel I could not win and a rebel he could hang. Instead, I wrote, in the warmest and most correct language the empire owned, a loyal warden's dutiful report. To the crown's frontier justiciar, to the charter houses, to the Count of Highmore, to every lord whose attention Earl Voss had spent a decade avoiding, went the sorrowful, faithful account of how the loyal, tribute-paying town of Duncairn had been set upon in the night by a host of reavers and unmarked sellswords, who, most troublingly, my lords, carried freshly minted Blackmore silver in their purses, and whose captured captain speaks of a paymaster in the march. And how the warden, being a humble and law-abiding vassal, most earnestly begged his gracious protector, the Earl of Blackmore himself, to investigate with all vigor who in his own domain could possibly have armed barbarians against a loyal town, and to bring the guilty, whoever they might prove to be, to the crown's justice. I never named him. I did not have to. I laid the Blackmore coin and the chief's testimony and the plain facts on the table in front of the whole frontier and begged the Earl to find the villain, and in doing so I put him in a box with no door. If Voss investigated, he must be seen to punish his own hand, or fail publicly to find what everyone now knew, and if he did nothing, his silence was the confession. Either way, the secret murder he'd needed was gone forever. He could never again send deniable steel against Duncairn, because the frontier was now watching, and the next reaver host to carry Blackmore coin would prove every word I'd so loyally declined to say. I had not beaten the Earl. A candle does not beat a blaze. But I had taken the one weapon a man like Voss truly relied on, the darkness, the deniability, the story the morning tells, and I had lit it up in front of the whole world and left him standing in it, smiling, with nowhere to put his hands. Osric sealed the last copy and sat a long moment looking at it. "When your father sent me to watch you die, my lord," he said, "I thought I understood the whole game of the frontier, that the strong take and the weak are taken, and the only cleverness is in choosing the winning side early." He set the seal down. "I have served you 4 months. In that time I have watched a soft boy with no army and no coin beat the toll that strangled this march for 10 years, and box an earl into his own courtesy twice, with nothing but a pen and the truth arranged properly. I no longer believe I understood the game at all. A dry, almost warm flicker. I find, at my age, that being wrong about that is the most interesting thing that has happened to me in 30 years. It was, from Master Osric, a declaration of something close to love, and I took it as such, and neither of us said so. The Dominion told me what we had become on the morning the first free trader came up the Greywater to Duncairn to buy salt, not down to the coast, but up to us, unafraid, in the open, and I stood on the new quay and watched it come, and the interface rose quiet in my vision and gave me a word it had been climbing toward since the day my boots first touched the dead salt. Rank, free village to chartered town. A market that others come to. New site granted. The march has noticed. A chartered town. 4 months before, the same interface had shown me a graveyard with 214 people waiting to fall into it. Now it named Duncairn a market that others come to, a town with a wall and a trade and a name. A place on the frontier that mattered enough that free men would risk the Earl's displeasure to do business at its quay. Earl Voss's blockade had broken, and it had broken not because I fought it but because I had made it cost him. A great lord cannot be seen to strangle the trade of a loyal town he has just been publicly begged to protect. The traders felt the change before they understood it, the way water finds a channel, and they came first Captain Maeve, unrepentant and grinning and ready to pretend she'd never been warned off, then others. Up the drowned road Harrow had forgotten, and Voss could no longer close. And the people came, in numbers now, not 2s and 3s. Word of the salt town that beat an earl's steel in the dark ran through Blackmore's hollow villages like fire through dry reed, and the harvested, hopeless people of the march began to vote with their feet, down the coast track, and across the flats to the one place on the frontier where a man's worth was not measured by the lord who owned him. Every one of them was a hand to build with and a mouth to feed, and though Earl Voss was slow to understand it, a small permanent theft from his own domain, a person subtracted from Blackmore's misery and added to Duncairn's cause. My town swelled. The wall lengthened. The pans spread across the flats. Bram raised a proper market square, and Call's Forge became 3 forges, and Myra ran the growing whole of it with a hard hand and a harder fairness, and never once let me forget that a town is not a wall or a trade. It is the people, and that a lord who forgets that has already lost it. I stood on the quay that morning with coin in my treasury and a chartered town at my back, and a wall that had beaten an earl, and I let myself, for one breath, feel the size of what 200 discarded souls had built out of a graveyard in 4 months. One breath, because I had learned by now that the breath you take to admire a thing you've built is the breath in which the next problem walks in and sits down across from you. It walked in that afternoon, in the shape of a rider from the south, in colors I had been half waiting for since I'd lit a small lamp in a careful count's window. The rider wore the gray and green of Highmoor, and he carried a letter, and the letter changed the shape of my war. Count Varen of Highmoor had watched a forgotten warden survive Earl Voss's toll, survive his squeeze, and then survive his deniable steal and box him publicly for the sending of it. And a careful neighbor who had spent his life keeping his head down before the Earl of Blackmoor had done the sums at last, and concluded that a strong Duncairn on Voss's western flank was worth the risk of a friendship. The letter was still cautious. Varen was a cautious man, and he committed to nothing that could be waved in an angry earl's face. But it proposed, in careful words, a trade agreement, Highmoor's grain and timber for Ashmarch's salt, direct, cutting Voss's factors out of both, and it proposed more quietly between the lines, the thing that trade agreements have always really been. We should be friends, you and I, because we are both, in our different ways, tired of Blackmoor. It was an alliance in the shy first close of commerce. It was the lamp in the window answered at last, and it meant that the next time Earl Voss reached for me, he would have to reckon not with a lone warden on a salt flat, but with a warden who had a count at his back and a trade the whole South had a stake in. But it was not the count's careful proposal that kept me up that night. It was the hand it was written in, because Count Varen had not written the letter. It was signed on his behalf, precise and quick, by the same hand that had answered my first tentative overture a month before, the daughter who kept his correspondence, and Osric's ears had long since confirmed, ran a great deal more of Highmoor than her cautious father knew. And this letter was not a clerk's dictation. I had read enough of Osric's hand behind my own words to know a mind showing through courtesy when I saw one, and hers showed through everywhere, in a turn of phrase too sharp for a cautious old count, in a proposal structured with a cleverness that anticipated 3 of Voss's objections before he could raise them, in a single dry line near the end that had no business in a formal letter, and that I read 4 times. My father's envoy will tell you Highmoor offers salt trade and friendship. I will tell you plainly, Warden, that Highmoor offers an ally against a man we both know means to eat us one at a time, and that I would rather treat with the lord who boxed an earl with a pen than with the earl. Do not mistake my father's caution for mine. It was signed Cassia Varen. And I sat a long time with it in the lamplight, that letter from a woman I had never met, and I felt the same thing I had felt reading the Dominion's first appraisal of a drunk against a wall and a smith who mended buckets. The particular attention I paid to a mind that saw the true shape of a thing the way I did. I did not know that night what Cassia Varen would become to me. I only knew that of everyone I had traded words with in 4 months on the frontier, the smiling Harrow, the reasonable Voss, the careful Count. She was the first whose mind I wanted, plainly and at once on my side of the table. And I wrote back to her, past the formal reply to her father, one honest line of my own, because I had learned that the only way to draw out a mind like that is to show it yours. Lady Cassia, I do not mistake it. Come and see what we've built and treat with the warden directly. I think you'll find we want the same wall to fall. I did not know when she would come, but I knew, sealing it, that she would, and that when she did, The war for the frontier would have two clever people on my side of it instead of one, and that this, more than the wall or the salt or the chartered town, was the thing that would decide it in the end. I learned how Earl Voss took the news through Hugh's own shuttered lantern, which is to say, I learned it from the mouth of the man the Earl still believed was his, because a spy you have turned is a window into the enemy's own house, and I had turned mine, and through it I heard the exact shape of a great man's fury, and it frightened me more than the Reaver host had, because Earl Voss did not rage. That was the thing that came back down the traitor's channel and sat cold in my chest for a long time after. A small man, beaten twice by a boy he'd sent out to die, rages, throws the wine cup, hangs a messenger, sends an army in the daylight and damns the cost. Earl Voss did none of it. Osric's ears and Hugh's reports agreed on the same unsettling picture. The Earl received my loyal report and my public box, understood in a glance that he had been outdone and could not answer, and then simply went quiet, dismissed his haul, cancelled the Reaver's second purse, recalled the men on the coast road, and settled, with the terrible patience of a man who has all the time and coin in the world, to the long game. He had learned the one thing I had most feared teaching him, that I was not a soft boy who'd gotten lucky, but a builder who would keep beating the cheap, fast methods. And so he put the cheap, fast methods away, and reached instead for the slow, total ones a Blaze and an Earl can afford and a chartered Warden cannot. He said your name only once, my lord, when he thought no one who mattered was listening. Hugh brought it to me himself, gray with the weight of it. He said, the Vale boy is not a problem to be solved. He is a weed, and you do not fight a weed, you starve its ground and weight. Then he smiled, they said, the way he does, and went into his supper as though nothing had happened at all. Starve its ground and weight. I turned that over a long time, and I understood it for the true threat. It was worse than any host, because there was no wall to build against it. Voss would not come at Duncairn again with steel he could be blamed for. He would work the slow rot he was a master of. He would poison me to the crown and the neighboring lords, patient lie by patient lie. He would strangle my trade at every remove he could not be seen to touch. He would wait for the blight and the winters and the endless grinding hardship of the frontier to do his killing for him, and he would be there, smiling, patient, rich, whenever I stumbled. He had decided I was a weed, and a great lord does not pull a weed in a season. He shades it and starves it and waits for the drought, and Earl Cadman Voss had more seasons and more coin and more patience than any drought I could imagine. I had beaten his month. Now I was in his years. And I understood, hearing that cold word come back through a traitor's mouth, that episode by episode of this long war I was going to have to become a great deal more than the man who dug a well and boxed a toll, because the enemy at the top of the frontier's rot had just stopped underestimating me, and a Blaze who takes you seriously is a very different wall from a Blaze who finds you amusing. Good. Let him starve my ground. I had made a fortune out of poisoned salt and a road out of a drowned river and an army out of the discarded. I would make something out of his patience, too. I always did, once I could find the ground. And there was one patch of ground I was beginning to understand, that neither Earl Voss nor I fully stood on, an older, stranger ground under all of it, that had been trying to get my attention since the very first dawn. The Red Chief gave it to me, in the end, in the long, slow days of his mending, because a proud man with nothing left to lose and a strange young lord who spared him will eventually say the thing that has been sitting behind his teeth. I had kept my word to him, his wounds tended, his surviving men fed, his worth, as I'd promised, not wasted. And in exchange, over the weeks, he began to talk, in the flat hard way of the horse tribes, and much of it was the ordinary intelligence of an enemy turned useful, Voss's coin, Voss's methods, the sellsword companies of the frontier. But one night, when I asked him plainly why his people raided the marches at all, why they came out of the deep frontier to burn towns like mine, he was quiet a long time, and then he told me a thing that turned the whole story I thought I was in on its head. You think we raid because we are cruel or hungry or paid. He looked at me across the fire with his red paint gone and his hard face older than I'd known. "We raid because we are running. The deep grass is dying, Lord, not by drought, by the gray, the wrongness, the thing that kills the ground and does not stop. It has been spreading out of the far waste for 3 winters, faster each one, and it eats the land my people have ridden for 1,000 years, and where it comes, nothing grows and nothing lives, and the horses go mad. We do not raid the marches for gold. We raid them because they are the last living ground between us and the gray, and we are being pushed onto them, tribe, by a thing your fat lords in their stone houses do not even know is coming." He was quiet. "Your Earl thinks the blight is a bad patch of salt on a dead frontier. He is a fool. It is a tide, and it is coming for his stone house too, and mine and yours, and it does not take coin, and it does not fear armies." He looked at me then with something I could not name. "It fears one thing. I saw it on the flats, Lord. I saw the gray thing flinch from the fire in your hand. In 20 years I have never seen the gray fear anything. Whatever you are, you should find out, quickly, before it comes for all of us." I did not sleep much after that, because it fit all of it, the pieces I'd been filing away cold since the first dawn. The West Salt runs deeper than a village this old should allow. The thing that killed the ground black and walked toward my town. The 3 lords who vanished, not died. The blight that was not a bad patch of salt but a tide, spreading out of the deep waste, eating the world one winter at a time, that the great lords in their stone houses were too busy farming their own people to even see. And the silver fire, sealed in a discarded veil sun, that the gray wrongness feared, the one thing on the whole frontier, perhaps in the whole empire, that the coming tide had flinched from. I had come to the Ashmarch believing my war was with a corrupt earl, and it was. I had learned my war was also with a rotten order that farmed its people, and it was. But underneath both of those, older and colder and stranger, there was a third war I had barely glimpsed, a war between the living world and a gray tide coming to swallow it, and a sealed fire in my chest that was, for reasons no one could yet explain, its enemy. Earl Voss meant to starve my ground and wait for the drought. He did not know that the true drought was already coming, for all of us, out of the west, and that the discarded boy he'd sent to die on the salt might be the only thing in the empire that the drought was afraid of. I put it away, the way I'd learned to put away every truth too big to build on yet. But I did not put it away cold this time. I put it away the way you set aside the load-bearing beam, the one everything else will finally have to rest on, when the building is tall enough to need it. They had sent me to the Ashmarch to vanish. That was 4 months and a lifetime ago. I stood on the wall of a chartered town in the last light of a good day, and I made myself take the full measure of it, because a man who never counts what he's built is as much a fool as a man who never counts what he's spent. Below me, Duncairn was alive. The market square Bram had raised, the 3 forges glowing, the pans stretching white and orderly across flats that had been a poisoned graveyard. The quay, where free traders' boats rode at their moorings up a river, a smiling lord had believed he owned. 214 starving souls had become a town of near 1,000, and every new soul was a person subtracted from the rot at the top of the frontier, and added to the thing I was building against it. I had a wall that had beaten an earl, a trade the whole South was starting to want, a treasury with real coin in it, a drowned road and a chartered market, and a name that ran through Blackmore's hollow villages like a promise. An old salt runner who'd found his river, a smith who'd found his forge, a builder who'd found his craft, a hard woman who'd found a town worth the fighting for, a steward who'd come to bury me and stayed to believe, a knight who'd taught me to hold a fire I was only beginning to understand, a boy who'd never learned how to leave me, a distant ally in the South, and a mind behind her father's letters that I already wanted at my table, and a fire in my chest, one rung up a ladder that climbed higher than I could yet see, that the coming dark of the world itself had flinched from. And arrayed against all of it, an earl who had stopped underestimating me and settled in to starve my ground across the years, a rotten order that would fight to its last breath to keep proving that people were worth nothing, a 9-year-old girl in a Blaze's castle who I had sworn before the dead to bring home, and no earthly idea yet how, and a gray tide coming out of the west that did not take coin and did not fear armies, and that only I, it seemed, could make afraid. It should have been too much. 4 months before, it would have been. But I had learned the one thing the Ashmarch had to teach, the thing it had beaten into me, a poisoned well and a drowned road and a broken wall at a time, that every impossible thing is only a wall, and every wall is only a problem, and every problem has a ground you can build on, if you are willing to be wrong first cheaply and right second, and to see the worth in what everyone else has thrown away. The salt, the drunk, the traitor, the discarded, the salt runner, the enemy, the self they told you was nothing. They had sent me here to vanish. Instead I had built, out of the thing they threw away, a town that beat an earl, and I was only just at the very bottom of the ladder. There was a barony above a chartered town and a county above a barony, and above all of it, a crown for the whole frontier that no one had worn in living memory, and above even that, apparently, a gray war for the world itself, waiting for me to grow tall enough to reach it. Cassia Varin was coming to see what we'd built. Hugh's daughter was waiting in Blackmore for a promise I meant to keep. Earl Voss was smiling and starving my ground and waiting for a drought that was already, unknown to him, on its way. And the fire in my chest was one rung up a ladder to something none of us had a name for yet. Let them all come. The weed, the Earl had called me. Good. He should have remembered what a weed does to a wall given time, the patient, splitting, unstoppable thing it does to even the greatest stone once its roots have found the seam. I had found the seam. I had 4 months ago, the morning my boots first touched the salt, and I have always been able to build once I can find the ground. End of episode 2, The Frontier Crown.